Hello. My name is Deborah Simmons, and I am an individual here for House Bill 3089. Thank you to Representative Hull for filing this important legislation. Thank you to the Chair and Committee for this hearing and the opportunity to discuss transparency issues around school health advisory councils, also known as SHACs in the state of Texas. All meetings of the Council must be conducted in compliance with Chapter 551, Government Code, which refers to open meetings. This bill adds those words to Texas Education Code 28004. People are generally surprised to find out that SHACs are not required to comply with Open Meetings Act. I served almost 2 years on my district SHAC after the Board of Trustees disbanded and reorganized the district's council. In 2012, parents and citizens learned about SHACs after a recommendation was being considered by the Board of Trustees. We filed open records requests trying to find out when the SHAC meetings had been held, who attended the SHAC meetings, and what decisions had been made. We searched emails and meeting postings to figure out who had been notified about these meetings. The SHAC must provide advice to the district on coordinated school health programming and assist the district in ensuring that local community values are reflected in the district's health education instruction. This is an important council in each district doing important work. This bill will require each Texas school district to post notice of the date, hour, place, and subject 72 hours prior to the meeting, allow the public to attend and provide an opportunity for public comment, prepare and maintain minutes of the meeting that state the subject and content of each deliberation, and indicate each vote, order, decision, or other action taken by the council during the meeting. Please pass and support legislation for SHAC transparency. Thank you.
All right. Any further questions of this witness, members? I think Representative Tallarico has a question.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I was listening to some of the testimony and a lot about family values, community values, and I'm curious if you think when making health decisions, if we should be guided by science or community values.
Well, I do believe that we have a diverse opinion across the state of Texas, and throughout the different school districts, each school district would consider what their community values are when looking at health curriculum. When we look at what was adopted last year by the State Board of Education, 617 student expectations. Not all of those are science. Most of them are actually character. When we teach sex education, we often acknowledge that it's about 10% biology and 90% character. So we're not always talking about science-based questions in these health education discussions. Whether it's sex education or suicide or some of the other things, that it actually does come down to character in a lot of cases. And we should honor local control. And as a decentralist, I think that we should put that responsibility back to the districts and also equip them to be able to provide the best information to their communities and do the right thing so that both sides of the issues are addressed when they're addressing these sensitive topics.
Sure. On many scientific topics, there aren't two sides, at least not two valid sides. So if the best practice in terms of public health is to let teenagers know about contraception and how they can access contraception, especially if they're sexually active, if that's the best practice based on research and evidence and science, but a community doesn't believe in contraception, which one should we follow?
So this bill is about transparency, which means that conversation can be had in the school district. So if they're having private meetings and they're closing it off to the public, then is that the right way to handle these meetings? They should be open to the public and allow the public to see the conversation and to actually have the dialogue like we are having. And that should be going on in the school districts in these important councils, regardless of whether we agree or disagree. And I've advised all school districts, or all parents throughout school districts that I talk to across the state to always look for the best practices, not to look for just their values being represented or their value set being represented by the leadership. And so we want to make sure that those meetings are open so that the dialogue can happen and it's a healthy conversation rather than closing or preventing parents from participating.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with the need for transparency. I'm glad Representative Hull is bringing this bill because I do think transparency and accountability is important. I worry about turning conversations based on science and evidence and empirical research into a show of hands, right? who believes in this? And that's, if we're making decisions about the health of our students, I think we should be guided by something more solid than public opinion.
I think we risk more chaotic situations when we don't follow the laws, particularly like Open Meetings Act. When the shacks are not structured in these ways, it actually becomes more chaotic rather than more structured.
I think Representative Binal has a question.
You just said something that I thought was interesting. This is not my area, but shacks are advisory, right? They don't make decisions that a district or any particular teacher has to follow. So the decision to adopt their recommendations is at the trustee level, at the school board level, and
Yes.
those meetings are open. There are subject to the Open Meetings Act, and then so is it that this body in particular should be subject to open meetings, whereas other advisory councils are not, or are we expanding it to all advisory bodies being subject to the Open Meetings Act?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've only served on school health advisory councils, but let me share my perspective. There are school districts across the state who will receive recommendations from their shacks and they'll rubber stamp them. So they don't even review the recommendation. It's provided, sometimes I've seen it in a consent calendar agenda item and just literally passed through. So accountability is another feature that I look for when I'm talking to people about legislation. This is just a transparency bill, but it's still a very good bill.
But it's transparency for the sake of involvement, interaction. And I guess you've got elected representatives who they've signed up for that. Right, they've signed up to be interacted with, and
Yes.
you can go to the meeting and talk about something, even if it's on the consent agenda. I guess I'm curious about what makes this advisory group different than any other advisory group, and why they wouldn't also be subject to open meetings. And I guess as a parent, like, I mean, someone who's very young, so I'm kind of trying not to think about it right now, but I don't know how you ever get this right. In other words, on this subject, you know, regardless of where you are in Texas, that there's going to be differing opinions on this, right? There just is. How do you structure this in a way where you get whatever the desired outcome is?
Well, I'm not sure about the question of the desired outcome, right?
Well,
I mean, it all goes back to parents, right, and parental responsibility. And the law in 28004 is very good about allowing parental rights for opt-out.
Right.
I will note that there's very little enforcement in education code, at least from my observation. 28004 in particular, I've been speaking to people I've been doing this for 8.5 years, basically. And school districts across the state break 28004 regularly. They don't comply with the law. This is interesting because I'm wondering about the enforcement ability of the Open Meetings Act because it's an education code rather than the government code. And then yet I still think that this is a step in the right direction for transparency. I'd love to speak more about the accountability issues and the fact that the school board members are not always representing, or the decisions that are being made in these shacks sometimes are not traceable or accountable back to the voter, which is really what we want, right? Because the school board is accountable to the voter. But if these decisions are sometimes being made within the shack and just with the administration, that can be a problem too. So there are some best practices that should be followed for accountability.
And my last question is how, in an unelected body that's advisory, what sort of accountability would a voter be able to exercise over that body, with the exception of maybe disruption?
So not to distract from this bill, I'm very much for this bill. For example, Senate Bill 442 that Senator Hughes has been working through the Senate, and the companion has been filed by the chair, 3872. It actually has an interesting accountability requirement because we actually have problems with the appointments that are made. So who is on the shack? Who decides who's on the shack? So for example, in my school district, it was whoever showed up at the meetings. So then you have to go back to, well, who knew about the meetings because of it wasn't being, the notices weren't being publicized. So whoever showed up was able to vote. So in 442 and House Bill 3872, there's actually a requirement that every member
I
of the
would caution you to just talk about this bill at the moment, because those other two bills are not before
Sorry.
us. And you don't want to,
I appreciate your responses and how thorough you know what I just, it's advisory. And so I think that we have to sort of be careful about what this would mean for every otherwise advisory body that lends itself to helping out or just advising or
Right.
bad advice to a school district.
So if the Board of Trustees is appointing every single member, then there is accountability.
Okay.
But if they're not,
all right. Any further questions, members? No further questions. Thank you, ma'am.
thank you.